people want to know why they've had what I call essentially bad luck a lot of the time. They're like, why has this happened to me? And, sometimes there's a really clear thing, but a lot of the time it's just bad luck. It was a bad day. You're not doing anything wrong. Your body is not doing anything wrong. It's just circumstantial. Pain is a fact of life.
We are live with Elodie Fratt, who has been, we've been in each other's lives for a long time now. I was thinking about the first time I ever heard about you was one of your students came to my class and was like, have you ever done the class of Elodie's? And I was like, no, who is Elodie? And she's like, we call her the smiling assassin. Super friendly,
Perfect.
super bubbly, super nice person. Let me tell you, when you're in her classes, she doesn't take any prisoners. And I was like, ooh, this sounds like my cup of tea. And then in the end, we ended up getting to know each other and becoming friends. It's so nice to have you on the show, Elodie, because your life has literally taken so many twists and turns, and all for the better. I know that you started out in the world of dance, you went into the world of yoga, and you now have retrained and become an osteopath. So I'm so curious to ask you more. I've given the nutshell version, but if you want to give us a more detailed introduction, it would be so nice to hear from you.
Yeah. I grew up in France. So that's kind of where I originally started life, and then decided to come and dance train in the UK. So I kind of did conservatoire training up in Leeds at the Northern School of Contemporary Dance. And then came to London and kind of performed for a few years. And it's a tough life being a contemporary dancer. It's a tough life. And so a few years in, I was like, I can make a tough decision now and leave this now, or I can keep going till I'm like 30 plus and make an even harder decision then. So I was like, I think I'm going to make the hard decision now. And at the time, I applied to go back to study osteopathy. And I got really worried once I got in. I got really worried I was going to miss performing. So I didn't go. I ended up turning down the place and didn't go, and ended up by chance working as an events manager for a few years. And in that time, obviously couldn't go to professional dance classes anymore because they were during working hours. So I started going to yoga more. And I'd done yoga kind of since dance training, really. When I auditioned, they were like, you're very weak. You're a lovely dancer, but you're very weak. Didn't quite word it like that. But like, you need to go and do some yoga. So I went back to France and I did yoga. But yoga in France at the time was very, very gentle. So it really didn't do what they were hoping it was going to do. So I'd always kind of done yoga since my teens as a consequence, but not really gone into anything too seriously. And so I Googled hot yoga Clapham and I ended up at Yoga Haven. And I was doing like hot vinyasa and really loved it. And that was like the first time I'd done hot yoga that wasn't Bikram. And really loved it. And I was like, oh, don't make any rash decisions because I'm quite spontaneous. But 6 months later, I was on teacher training. So I did make a rash decision. But it did pay off, which was nice. And I've been teaching ever since. And then kind of probably 4 or 5 years into teaching, I was like, I kind of wish I'd done that degree because I have all these questions that I can't really answer. I just have to decide who I trust the most, and that's a bit frustrating. And so then I decided, maybe I will apply to one school of osteopathy. If I don't get in, then I've scratched that itch. And then if I get in, then I can make a decision. And then I did get in and I was really excited. And I was like, damn, I'm going to have to go and do this now. So I did that and then kind of kept teaching and then was working at Hotpod as like their head of teaching alongside. And then, finished that, still teaching a bit, less public classes now. Still teach anatomy on quite a few teacher trainings and then work as an osteopath alongside.
It's so great. I absolutely love that your curiosity led you down this path, because one of the things I picked up on while you were talking was that you said there were a lot of questions that I couldn't answer. And I'd love to know what those questions were, and have you found answers?
Oh, yeah. What were my questions? I think I noticed that people were getting, which is weird because obviously now that I'm qualified, I almost don't find the same things, but maybe the yoga world has evolved in that time. But I felt people were getting the same injuries repeatedly. And I didn't really know what to do with them in the class. As in, I was happy to give them a modification, but I was like, okay, now what? As
Mm.
in, I don't really know what to do with you. So that was one thing. And things like you hear all those kind of yoga myths, don't put your knee against your foot, don't do this, don't do that. And all of those things, I was just like, oh, I don't really know. I'm just listening to a few people give their opinion and basically then have to just make a judgment call, and there were a lot of things that I felt in my body were fine from like an experiential perspective. But I would teach it that way, but then people say to me, oh, you teach it differently to other people.
Mm.
But I couldn't really justify why half the time, because I was just like, well, this is my opinion I'm giving you. It's not necessarily based in fact, because I don't have access to those facts. So I had a lot of those types of questions. And, I think when you go into yoga to start off with, or it's definitely what I see with trainees, you have this thing that like yoga can solve everything. Yoga will save the world and save everything. And you think these poses do these specific things. I always get asked on teacher training, what does this pose do?
Mm.
Because you want to, that's kind of how you're taught yoga, that it can resolve, this pose will resolve this problem. You hear things in class that make you believe that. And I was like, that doesn't really sit with me. I don't think that's a thing. But obviously, again, I didn't have anything to either contradict or confirm. So I think I had a lot of those questions. And I don't know that it's given me the answer to those questions, because a lot of those things, there's absolutely no studies about it, because no one cares and no one wants to fund it, because it's actually not that important in the grand scheme of things. But now I guess I have the tools to critically evaluate the information, that there is, and then kind of have the knowledge around that to make an educated decision based on facts, even if it's an opinion based on fact. But then at least it's based on something, not just on, that's what I hear, so this is what I'm going to give
It
you.
is nice to come from that place of having a little bit more of an informed angle that you can give. Like, it's just insights, isn't it? You're like, look, this is what we know, this is what other people say, but it's also ultimately up to you and what you're, like you said, experiential level in the body. I think that's so valid for people, and it really has been something we've been taught to ignore, particularly because fear-mongering really sells well. Your business will thrive if you tell people what the right versus the wrong thing is, and unfortunately we just don't really know.
And what's interesting is in osteopathy, it's the
Mm.
same. So, I always say it's really easy to sell, this is happening because your pelvis is twisted right and your left shoulder is slightly elevated. I mean, unless I saw you the day before the injury happened, I don't really know whether that's relevant in this instance or not. It may be, but it may not be. I don't have anything to say yay or nay to that. But, people love that. People want to know why they've had what I call essentially bad luck a lot of the time. They're like, why has this happened to me? Sometimes it's a really clear thing, but a lot of the time it's just bad luck. It was a bad day. You're not doing anything wrong. Your body is not doing anything wrong. It's just circumstantial. Pain is a fact of life, and how you get through that at some point is how you manage it, as opposed to going, pain will never happen to you, this is just not realistic. And so I think it's easier to sell to people when you go, oh, it's because of this and I have all the answers and I will magically fix you. It's easier to sell that than to say, well, it may be this and maybe that. It's quite grey. And actually, even in manual therapy, that division is definitely there.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you raised this point. I feel like there was this brilliant study that they did to try and figure out what treatment modality was the most effective. And they looked at all the different types of massage and physios and osteos and chiros, and they analyzed everything. And one of the only unifying factors across all the different disciplines was how confident the therapist was. If you had a super
Yeah,
duper confident therapist that was like, look, it's XYZ and you're going to do what I say and you're going to be fine, then people were more likely to get better. And it's almost like it. And yet, if we do kind of come from that frame of reference when we're working with people, we are doing them a massive disservice in the same breath, because we aren't really able to give them accurate information.
Yeah. And in some ways, it's slightly terrifying that information is out there. That's fine. You don't need to know anything. You can just be confident. But at the same time, that does, I think, hold true a lot of the time. I think a lot of the time it's also and I don't mean this disparagingly, but it's holding the patient's hand and telling them they're going to be
Yeah.
okay, and you having the confidence to tell them that it is going to be okay and they are going to get through this bit, and once this process has happened, things will be better. But a lot of it is I think largely that relationship and how that manifests in the appointment and the impact that that's going to have then outside of the appointment.
Absolutely. It is like, yeah, like you say, it is worrying that that information's out there. But at the same time, I feel like the world, particularly within therapy, and I believe that the change is also slowly coming into the yoga world, more so actually even than the fitness world, is that the way we language and phrase things is starting to develop. And I feel like this is really empowering, even if you're not giving people all the answers, you're not giving them a definite X equals Y and therefore Z is going to happen. Even just slightly tweaking our language and the way we describe things can make a really big impact on somebody's journey in terms of rehabbing from an issue.
And it does make it more complex to teach.
Mm.
In some ways, it's very freeing, but I think in lots of ways, actually, particularly when you start to teach, it's really hard to account for all of that. And so actually, it's much easier to say, don't do this. It's always wrong. You must never do this. Let's move on. It's easier to go down that route. Whereas actually to hold all the nuance of that in a group class particularly is really hard. And so you have to let some things go. And I think that sometimes we're kind of used to managing stuff in the class. And so sometimes it's quite hard to let go of those
Absolutely.
things.
And for those of you who are listening and you're a little bit lost as to what Elodie and I are referring to, is that very often, you know, when you're teaching a group class, particularly, people love those clear black and white guidelines. And I think what Elodie is so beautifully describing is that there is so much nuance. Each and every individual is so different. And there is no way that we can give you black and white guidance because it's really not doing anyone in the room service.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know that you've trained under a number of different people, and I was kind of curious to hear your thoughts on this. My particular frustration around this very topic that we're talking about is that some of the big names in anatomy still haven't moved in this direction where they are still very black and white in their thinking, and there's still a lot of fear mongering in their language. And I just want to tear my hair out because I'm like, come on, there's so much good evidence out there. Why are we still stuck in the dark ages? And I'd love to hear your opinion on this. And maybe from there we can move on to some myths.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? I think because different lineages have different people that carry those lineages now have their purpose or their thoughts around anatomy and how they teach. And definitely when I come in as an anatomy teacher, I'm sometimes very mindful if I don't know the lead teacher's teaching style that well, I'm a bit worried about contradicting what the students will be hearing elsewhere. Now, I'm lucky enough that most trainings I teach on, I'm really familiar with the lead teacher's teaching style. And so that makes my life a bit easier because I kind of know where the catch points might be and vice versa. But sometimes that's not the case, and it's really tricky because there's a lot of contradictions. So I think sometimes a lead teacher or lead teachers will pick an anatomy teacher that they know resonates with their teaching style. It is easier for the student to some extent. And so sometimes I wonder how much that has an influence, but I think sometimes things just don't move on because they work. And so if it's working, then, it's like if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I think, if I think about Jivamukti, which I really love, but then the anatomy actually was really fantastic on there. But then relating it back to the practice doesn't always happen. So, Jivamukti is very alignment focused, which I really love. But does that resonate with how I think about the body outside of that? Not necessarily. And so that's a really interesting kind of mix of things. And if you look at Ashtanga, again, the tradition of Ashtanga is not particularly friendly to what we might know about anatomy. But I sometimes think that's things that we as Westerners have layered onto a practice that is not about that in the first place.
What is it about?
Because it's about energetics, I think a lot of the time it's about energetics, and we talk about, traditional yoga. Okay, what is that? Is it Kriya? Is it postural yoga? Because actually postural yoga is really recent. So how traditional is that anyway in the grand scheme of things? And if you look at videos, like early days of yoga, the alignment what we would call alignment is all over the shop, right, compared to what we think is correct now, from people who, you know, are basically sharing that tradition from what we would think is the source. And so I think sometimes we layer things on that weren't there necessarily in the first place. So I think there's a little bit of that. There's a little bit of kind of tradition, and that's kind of what's nice about yoga in some ways, is that there is this kind of mix of stuff, and we're trying to layer these different ideas, and, you know, modern versus old, and bringing something into modern day, and how does it work for today's bodies and today's minds, because we like to understand why and kind of really pick stuff apart. But sometimes those things don't match up with what we're teaching, and I think even if sometimes we have the knowledge, it doesn't necessarily always carry through into the actual physical practice and how it's delivered. So it's quite an interesting mix, and I don't know why things haven't necessarily evolved. Sometimes I think a lot of people who teach anatomy on teacher training maybe have trained a long time ago, or no longer practicing in terms of like as clinicians, you know, if they do have that background. So maybe updating their skills is not there. But also I think, you know, even in physio, in
It happens as
osteopathy, in chiro,
well.
I'm sure
It's
it's the
so the
same,
same.
that yeah, that there's still those really like limiting beliefs that I think not every school has changed how they teach that. You know, I come from a school that's really evidence based, which again, you know, it kind of makes it harder because you don't have, you know, it's a lot of gray and purple and whatever. It's not
It's
very
very
black and
rainbow.
white. But that's yeah, but it's very
It is.
disconcerting. It's disconcerting when you come in wanting answers and actually you come out with more
Mm.
questions, which now I love, but it is hard, you know. And your whole education, you go, you must get comfortable with
Mm.
uncertainty, and you don't quite realize how much that is true.
Wow. Fantastic
You
that
know,
you were taught that.
yeah, and you don't realize how true that holds. And I think it's really fine to say you don't know. I
Yeah.
really love being able to say, well, you know, it could be this, it could be this. Doesn't really change anything in the
Yeah, and
immediate.
my favorite thing is it
So
depends. It's my favorite word to say when people are like, but XYZ and so told me. I'm like, it really depends though, because there's quite a
yeah.
few other versions where that could be the total opposite. And for those of you guys that are listening, it could be that someone asks you a question like, you know, I was taught that putting my foot against my knee in a tree pose is bad for me. And it could be like, but for other people, that sensory feedback against the inner knee could be super useful. And for others, maybe there's a previous trauma that happened on the inner knee. And if the foot makes contact with that, the brain goes into threat mode. And then that could be a really negative thing for that person. So, with absolutely everything, it depends.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the time it's like, oh, this person said
Mm.
this. And I'm like, well, you'd have to ask them why they told you that, because out of context, it's hard for me to comment on what the intention behind that was.
It's so why I wanted to bring you on the
It's
show because
never,
of that really level way that you've always had, even before you trained and you working as a yoga teacher. You've always had this really level-headed, you know, I don't know how to describe it. Do you know what I'm trying to say? You're just like, well,
sometimes, yeah.
exactly, exactly. What are some of the myths that you're still encountering, particularly in your practice as an osteopath, but also as a yoga teacher? There's still some that are kind of creeping in, and maybe we could center a little bit of the chat around dispelling some of those.
Yeah, less and less. Again, I think yoga teachers are becoming more educated. I think they're getting better at communicating better in their classes on the whole. So I think generally things are getting much better. Some of the stuff I hear that kind of upsets me that I hear from students when, you know, I'm teaching on teacher training, it's things like, oh, is it true that I hold emotion in my hips? You know, and if my hips are tight, it means that
Mm.
like something's not released. And I'm like, I don't know, do you cycle 100 miles a week? Maybe that's a factor. Who knows, you know? And I'm like, you can't, yeah, maybe, but you can't put that on people in a
Mm.
room when you don't know anything about them. And I was like, why is it your hip that's holding that and not your
Mm.
calf? You know, I'm like, okay, let's accept, let's go, cool, yeah, the body stores trauma in the form of tightness. Let's accept that without question, move on from that bit. But I'm like, let's accept that. why the hip and not the calf or the armpit or the neck or
Beautiful.
whatever? Why that? And so then I'm like, so then I start, then you start to unpick it and it's like, it doesn't make sense by
Mhm.
itself. And I'm like, I think it's those things that I find a bit troubling, because I'm like, that's letting people come out of a room with ideas about what their body means that are not necessarily there. So I find that those things I find a bit upsetting. The one that also still comes back is this thing of kind of the hip, kind of going, I don't know, from warrior three to half moon and into standing splits or whatever, kind of coming to that external rotation back into internal rotation. That one still comes up intermittently as
Wait,
being,
let's just give
negative
people a
for the
bit of
hip and
context.
kind
So
of
it's when you're weight bearing on one leg and the pelvis is in motion between an open
yes,
and a closed hip position, that a lot of people say that that
yes.
is very, very harmful and you'll ground away the top of the hip or the hip socket. And, my favorite thing to say to people is like, okay, let's say that's true. So every amputee is going to be grinding away their hip. Is that what you're saying? And it's usually what I think is that these people just haven't worked with a wide enough population group to understand how much nuance actually there is. Because as soon as you start working in a setting where you're dealing with very unwell people or people with severe physical limitations, that your understanding of the human body gets exploded into a million different directions. And I love using the
Mm.
example of an amputee with that exact myth, because I'm like, you're going to fearmonger that whole entire population that they're grinding away their hip? You would never do that to someone who's lost a leg.
But also, I'm like, if you think about playing any
Thank you.
sport, when you're running, you're on one leg at some stage.
Changing
If you're
direction.
if you're kicking
Yeah.
a ball, exactly. And so I'm like, so why just now in an environment where you're moving as slow as a sloth? Because let's face it, in yoga we move real slow, so we can really monitor what is happening on the whole. If you look at injuries in yoga, they are repetitive stress injuries on the whole, because we are moving slowly. There is a lot of repetition. And so things like that, I'm like, okay, but you're talking about potential arthritic changes in the hip, but we know that movement generally is better for arthritic changes. So how do you start to unpick that? And why is it only a problem if you're standing on one leg? And, it's then not consistent when you put it against other parts of the practice. So that one still comes up. And then the other one that comes up sometimes still, which I find slightly bewildering, is kind of rolling up the
Oh,
spine,
I didn't know that
like
was
from
still
a
out
rag
there.
doll.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And I'm like, it's really hard, because I'm like, that's a really strong belief. People are worried. I don't know what they're worried about. That it's bad for you, that it's putting too much strain on the spine. And I'm like, unless you've got really severe osteoporosis, I don't really have any concern. But then they're happy to do a cat cow, and to me, then I'm like, well, why is it okay there? Oh, well, because your hands are on the floor. I'm like, okay, but like, as in, it's still pretty
Yeah.
minimal
What about if
load.
you're in a handstand and then lowering your feet between your palms? I mean, that is essentially a reversed roll through the spine. It's just in the lower sections. I mean, yeah, there's so many things that we could pick
Yeah,
apart there and be like, but over here you do it like humble warrior. That's going to be like a flexed spine coming down.
so many
Exactly.
places. So that's one that comes up. And then, all the things that are more about systemics. So um, things like, when you twist, does it
Okay.
detoxify? When you do this, does your blood flow reverse if you're in a handstand? I'm like, well, you'd be sending deoxygenated blood back into your body. Is that what you want to do? I don't think that's what you want to do. Does taking a deeper breath bring more oxygen to the brain? All of these kind of more physiological things. And it's sometimes I feel mean, because I feel like I'm breaking everyone's magic. And I'm like, yeah, no, that's not happening. No, that's not happening.
I like it. I've got that weird
So yeah,
twisted six side of me that's like, no, 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 no. And I'm like, oh, I really got to like move past this adolescentness that I've carried with me my whole life. That's why I need to hang out more with you,
yeah. So
because
I
you're
think
like, let's keep it cool, Sel. Just be cool. I'm like, me, 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 me. Need to work on that.
yeah, exactly. But yeah, I do feel mean sometimes. I'm like, oh no, sorry, still not.
It's good.
Yeah.
It's good.
So I think those are the ones that come up the most
Okay,
frequently.
those are really great. I feel like also along those lines, let's also talk a little bit about pain, because people it's funny to me. I don't know if you find the same thing. People don't necessarily equate the fact that they have an injury with the fact that they're dealing with pain. It's really bizarre. So, for example, I'll give you an example to illustrate this. If I run a workshop on pain as a topic, I will have fewer attendees than if I run a workshop about yoga injuries. They don't get that it's the
Yeah,
same thing. And I'm like, because people really, really attach to a label. They absolutely love being told that their rotator cuff is inflamed or that they've got a swollen bursitis or that their ligament has been torn. And what's so interesting when we start looking at pain science is that even if those degenerative changes are present, it doesn't actually mean that the pain they're experiencing is related to those structures, that those degenerative changes are a very normal part of aging. And that doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be in pain. There are lots of people with those changes that have no pain.
yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting that people, what you're saying about people not coming if it's like, if they're like, oh, it's pain. No, that's not me. But yeah, I'm injured. It's quite interesting that because actually, obviously, you could be injured with no pain and you could have pain with no injury. So I guess in some ways they can be dissociated. But it's interesting that people often, even though the thing that they're experiencing in their practice that is annoying for them is more often than not pain. It's not weakness. It's not, unless the injury is very severe, it's very rare that I get someone who comes in who's a yoga practitioner who goes, oh, I have a problem because everything is really weak now when I do this. That's quite rare. Mostly I get, I'm experiencing pain when I do
Mm.
XYZ. But it's like people think they have to deal with the injury rather than dealing with the pain, or dealing with the pain and the injury, the function and the pain. They don't see them as things that are necessarily the same or related. They're like, I have this injury, I need to fix
And
the
then the pain
injury.
will
And it's like,
go
well, okay,
away.
but yeah, and sometimes it
Yeah.
does and
But it's
sometimes it
interesting when
doesn't.
that injury has been
Sometimes I
around for like 6 years. They're like, yeah, but it's still broken. I'm like, it probably would have healed by now.
it's no, it is not broken anymore.
Mm.
Yeah, and this is, I think that's where the education is lacking now in yoga. I think that's the place where, and I think now when I've got more time on teacher training, I'll do like a few hours on really basic pain science, because actually as teachers, that's the thing where people really struggle to manage their
100%.
students and the thing they're worried about, but it's the thing that they understand the least. And I'm like, actually, in a group class, realistically, you just need to hold space for that. And yes, there are like modifications that you should be able to offer and, all this kind of stuff, but there's a limitation to what you can do in that space, rather than just saying, well, you have to do absolutely everything in that hour when you've got 30
Mm.
people in the room. It's like, well, you just can't. It's just not really possible. And actually, a lot of the time now, a lot of the trainees will say to me, oh, well, I don't ask about injuries because I don't know what to do with it and I'm not a health professional. And I'm like, I understand that. And I guess if you're not assisting people, that's a choice. Fair enough. But I'm like, if you're putting your hands on people, for me, you really need to ask, because I'm like, well, you are, regardless of how compassionate you want to be with your assists and how level you want to be with your assists, from my perspective, you are still to some degree doing something to someone to an extent. It's kind of inevitable that creates a little bit of a power dynamic. And I speak as someone who loves assisting people. But as soon as you put your hands on people, I think you do need to know that, because you don't want to harm someone. And for me, there's an inclusion thing where I'm like, if someone came in, I don't know, with one leg, I wouldn't expect them to do the identical class to the person with two legs without any modification. I would want to be like, okay, cool. What can we do to make this the best experience possible for you in this moment? So similarly, if someone's got an injury, whatever it is, pain, whatever it is, I want to give them the best experience possible in that moment and hold space for them in my capacity in that moment. Doesn't mean I can resolve the issue, but it's just trying to include them in the practice as much as possible. It's not going to be perfect, but just trying to kind of catch everyone as much as you can.
And maybe it would be good. I do have a lot of yoga teachers that listen to this potty. So if a teacher is encountering a large group of people and there's someone saying, look, I'm in pain, what kind of, like, let's say someone comes to you after class and they're like very clearly, oh, my shoulder hurts. What is some of your strategies on helping teachers know how to manage those situations in the best way possible?
Mm. I mean, I think the first thing is, does it hurt all the time? Or is it hurting in a specific pose? And if it's a specific pose or a specific position, whatever that is, it doesn't have to be downward dog, but let's say it's when the arm is overhead, for example. Well, that's going to be downward dog, high lunge, all the things where the arm's overhead. I think at that point, it's very easy to go, okay, let's play around with some stuff for 5 minutes. What happens if you have your hands wider? What happens if you bend your elbows? What happens if you turn your hands in? What happens if you have a block under your hands? Whatever it is. And to just see, let's see if we can find a more comfortable space for you. It doesn't have to be based in any kind of necessarily super anatomical knowledge. Obviously, that helps, but it doesn't have to be. It can just be playing around with things to try and make it more comfortable for that person. And if you get to the point where you're up against a limitation, I always say to people, always have the number or email or websites of a few physios and osteopaths in the area that you trust, that you can say to people, listen, you probably do need to speak to someone about this. It's kind of beyond my remit. Here are these wonderful people that I recommend. Because then it's not like you don't care. You've tried. You are showing that you care by recommending someone. But actually, it's also honoring what a lot of teachers say, which is, I'm not a physio. I'm not this. I'm not that, which is completely fair enough. You can't know everything. You do need to know, your scope to then go, but these people here can help you. Go and speak to one of them. And then you've kind
I
of done
absolutely love your answer. Thank you so much for giving us that insight. And I guess another thing that I'm curious to know from your perspective at this moment is, when you're in your clinic, are you seeing something I ask all clinicians, by the way, what are the patterns that you're seeing in your client base right now? And are they yogis? Because it's interesting for me when I ask these questions to my physio friends that are working with a yoga population, they're like, I'm seeing a lot of XYZ coming through my doors. And it's really worrying because I feel like their yoga classes are contributing to this. Or maybe for you, you've got a wider population that you're working with. Maybe they're doing, I don't know, anything else. Is there anything that you're like, whoa, this is a major pattern and it's coming through my door time and time again?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I treat a really wide variety of people. So I treat a lot of performers. So that's kind of one part of my week. And I do treat quite a lot of yoga practitioners. And then a lot of more active people on the whole, not only, but it's rare that I have a few more elderly patients, but on the whole, even the people who kind of 60, 70, they're quite active people. So that's kind of more my patient base, a few athletes. So it's hard to say because it's a broad panel. I guess with yoga practitioners, a lot of them will come through either because I've taught them anatomy on a training or through someone else. That's often how they end up kind of seeing me. And I think often what I see is mainly concern for not being able to do their practice or not being able to do their practice how they want to do their practice. And often I'm like, that's almost holding you back as much as the injury itself, which is like, I don't want to modify. I don't want to do X, Y, Z. And you're just like, okay, well, if wheel is hurting, at this point, we either need to bin wheel for a bit. And if there's an injury, rehab that, reintroduce wheel. Or if it's just that wheel is inherently uncomfortable, we need to start to think about different strategies to manage that. And often people are like, no, I don't want to change what I'm doing. It's like, okay, but like this is currently a problem and we need to resolve the problem. So sometimes it's just, and I probably, I can understand that. I think when I was teaching maybe, in that third, fourth year of teaching where you feel like you're really getting somewhere and then you're like, I've got an injury.
I'm going to lose it all.
I can't do, no. Yeah. But, so I think there's a little bit of that, which happens quite a lot. And I think sometimes the thing I see is lack of understanding of why it's happened or how to manage it in their practice. So I think when I see yoga practitioners a lot of the time, I'm rehabbing, dealing with the issue, doing hands-on stuff, but I always give them the tools to actually manage it in their practice. Because I'm like, well, it's all well and good doing that, but realistically, I'm not going to say to you, don't go to yoga for 3 weeks. That's just never going to be in my dialogue. I really try and avoid taking people out of their activity unless it's, they've got a fracture and it then becomes completely ridiculous for them to do their activity with that fracture. But outside of that, I really try to avoid taking people out of whatever it is they love to do unless we're not getting anywhere and we're really coming up against something. And then, okay, cool, we need to make a concession. We need to reduce it, or we need to change how we're doing things. And often people have a bit of a reluctance to do that. So, but because they don't know how to manage it. So often it's about giving them kind of tools. And then when I see those people sometimes in the room, I'm like, you've really taken that on board, and they've really made it like a lifestyle change, like doing more strength training. And like, I don't know why this happened in the first place. But it's like, well, because, actually all you're doing is yoga. And so we need to kind of give you some other tools. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to go to the gym, but you need to have kind of some other stuff that you can do at home that is going to help you to kind of maintain your strength, particularly if you're doing a bit more of an acrobatic practice where you are going to need something to support all the range of motion that you're doing. So it's really nice to see that. But I think those are the main things that I see kind of repeatedly. They're more like behavioral things rather than like patterns. I mean, it's always the high hamstring tendinopathy / tear that I see a lot in kind of more flexible yogis. But again, less than I think I used to see it in class
Yeah,
historically.
people are definitely
So I
deadlifting a
think
bit
it's
more.
getting,
Slowly, slowly.
yeah, I think it's definitely getting better. I think in performers, there's still a bit of an aversion to strength training because of the aesthetics. So not necessarily with the guys, but definitely with some of the female performers, there's definitely still concerns around aesthetics of what it means to strength train. And I'm like, with people who, trying to bulk up have to really try. And so sometimes there's this thing of, I don't want to get bulky thighs, or I don't want to get bulky calves, or I don't, and actually I'm like, well, that takes quite a lot of effort. So if you look at people who are trying to do that, so there's a little bit of reluctance there sometimes. But again, I think that's changing. I think people are getting a lot better with all of that.
Amazing. What do you feel like is the next frontier in terms of maybe movement as a blanket term, but especially in the yoga world? Do you feel like, because obviously we're going through this evolutionary change with the way we approach movement, what do you feel is like the next thing that's coming up for everybody?
Mm. I think we're moving more towards hybrid training across the board. As in, I think people in every discipline are getting better at kind of accepting that actually your movement, your brain and your body like variety. And so I think people are getting much better at saying, oh, well, I do this primarily, but actually I do a lot of other stuff. And I think that's getting more and more true in every respect. So if I treat athletes, sometimes they're like, oh yeah, I do meditation
Mm.
now. And, if I treat yogis, they're like, oh, I go to the gym and I lift, or, that's happening across the board. And so I think we're seeing more hybrid styles of training. And I think that's going to become more and more true, that people are becoming much more discerning in terms of how to maximize their performance by giving their body some variety. And I think that's going to become more true. And I think we'll see more of that in training spaces, not just in like a gym where some people will still only use one part of that gym. They'll never do anything else. But I think also in things like, athletic training, which is already happening a little bit. But, you look at things like, I think it's Third Space now have sound baths
They
on in
do.
their gyms,
They do.
like frequently throughout the
It's so
week,
great.
and like you couldn't, even 5 years ago, that would never have
Yeah.
happened. And there's a lot of appetite for it. And so I think stuff like that's going to start happening more and more, which is lovely because it's kind of recognizing that people are people, not just bodies that are
Yeah,
doing
and
something.
those of you who are listening that aren't in London, Third Space is a gym, a very like, me man, me lift weight kind of gym. So it was like all very like tough people going there and doing really hard stuff, which was obviously amazing. And then they introduced a little bit of yoga, and they had a little bit of yin on the timetable. And as Elodie has just said, they also now have as airy fairy as it can get, which we love, obviously. That's totally our jam, is a little bit of sound healing. So that's really cool that that's happening. I have to agree with you. It's making me so happy whenever I talk to yogis that are doing calisthenics or squats. I'm just like, thank you. At last, there is that change that's slowly coming about. Is there anything else in the world of movement, the yoga world, or your osteopathy experience that you feel, "Oh, I wish more people knew this"?
Hmm. I mean, basic pain science. I think for me, that's the thing that comes back again and again. It's like, okay, why is this bad? Okay, well, and yes, there's the physical injury if there is one, but there's everything else. There's where you were when it happened. There's if someone had to tell you what it was, how you received that. There's everything else in your life and how happy that makes you or how unhappy that makes you and how stressed that makes you and how, whatever it is. So I think those basic kind of components, because they're really hard to deliver when someone is not, fully kind of with that, where I'm like, actually all pain lives in the brain, regardless of whether it's a paper cut or something really traumatic. And I'm not saying it's your pain. I'm not saying it's in your head. It is in your head, but it's in everyone's head. That's just how pain works. And so sometimes it's hard for people to receive. I have a teenager I'm treating at the moment, and they're brilliant at taking this on board, like so brilliant. I'm like, you are an A-star patient. And, I'll get an email a few days after. What can I do to not focus on the pain? So how do I get out of this cycle? And you're like, wow, like you're really taking this on board. This is amazing. That you're like, I send them videos and they're like, okay, yeah, that really makes sense. Now, how do I do this? And I'm like, it's part of me. I'm like, well, that's the $1 million question.
But there are so many great
that we
things
all try to solve,
because it really, like, what they're alluding to is something that, sorry to interject, Elodie, but one of the recent lectures that I was just watching on pain science is how effective distraction can be. And as simple as squeezing a tennis ball and telling them, squeeze it at 30%. Now do the movement that was hurting you. And they're like, oh, it's reduced by like significantly. I now have a 1 instead of a 9 in my visual analog scale, which is pain levels 1 to 10. So yeah, like basic distraction. And it was actually really fascinating studies which showed that people learning a task like juggling could help them manage their chronic pain. I mean, there's so much stuff out there like this, which is just fascinating.
Yeah, it's incredible. And so all of that stuff I think is really empowering, particularly, when people are experiencing a lot of pain. It's like, okay, this will pass, unless something does, malfunctions, we'll call it, but this will pass. High level of pain doesn't mean high level of injury necessarily. So I think, more pain doesn't mean you've made the injury worse necessarily. All of these things, I think they're really empowering for people. And so I think that if more people could know that, that would be, an amazing thing. I think that for a lot of people, that's also quite reassuring if they can take it and really keep that information and go, this isn't a criticism, this is just information, and I can take it on board and go and digest that. I think that that's really an amazing area of kind of research. There's so much research in it at the moment because it costs so much money, right? It costs people so much money to be in pain. It costs states so much money to have people in pain. And yeah, lots of stuff around neurology, which is really interesting. I mean, I do a little bit of kind of Z health stuff. I know you do. So kind of lots of kind of really fascinating stuff and kind of neuro kind of hacking and all these kind of things, which again, there's lots of crossover with things like yoga and other practices. And so I think if people could really kind of start to have an understanding of how their brain works, that would really carry through into, their treatment and how they approach treatment, how they approach life. So I think often the people I see where I'm like, you're incredible, kind of, you're maybe older and you're still going and, you started running 2 years ago. I've had people who are like well into their 50s who start pole vaulting, and you're just like, you are so great. I love this. And so I think that for me is really, you watch those people and you're like, what is different about you? What are you doing differently? And often it's their outlook. It's not necessarily that they live the healthiest life or, that they are made particularly better than anyone else. It's just their outlook is really positive and they are kind of very dynamic and energetic. They have this kind of really zest for life, I think. And I think people sometimes think how they are in the world is different to their health and their injury status and all that. And I'm like, they're the same. How you cope with the injury that is going to happen is completely interlinked with everything else. And that's really a big principle of osteopathy. We talk about that all the time, but I think that's still for, the average person in the street. There's almost that dissociation of who you are and what your body is.
Honestly, the more I'm listening to you, the more I'm like, thank goodness all these yoga teacher trainings have you. It so makes me so happy. It's so great. If you had one message for the world, It could be a bumper sticker. It could be a whole Bible that you hand out to every person. It could be a massive billboard. What would your message to the world be?
Mm, I think it's just enjoy
That's a
life,
good one.
you know? Do do what you need to do to make your life better. You know, there's limitations to that for everyone, but in the space that you have, enjoy life, make your life better. Don't wait for the thing to make the change or whatever it is. Make your life as fantastic as it can be in this time, in the space that you have.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Elodie. It's been such an honor to have you on the show. I'm so grateful that we have
Oh, thanks
had the
for
time
having
to do
me.
this. It's just been so amazing. Where can people find out more about you?
My website is the easiest, which is www.movingdynamics.net, or on Instagram, I'm Elodie_movingdynamics. And if you want to come be treated by me, you can find me at Pureform Beckenham and Pureform Bromley.
Oh my goodness, Beckenham, you literally are my neighbor here, dude. We need to sort this out. This is like a joke that we haven't actually, yeah, we haven't seen each other for a long time, but I'm so happy we made this happen. And thank you for sharing your wisdom. You've got such a beautiful way of explaining things. And yeah, just keep doing what you're doing because it's incredibly inspiring and more people need it.